This is Jason Cope. I'm on my second production journal, and this time we're taking the nice beautiful mold that we made last time and we're going to be sculpting an appliance right in this area of a cleaved face. So this is Roma plastilina clay. It's oil based and it's sulfur in it, so it's a little bit of a nasty clay, but it is wonderful for sculpting because it doesn't dry out. And so this is what I'm going to be using to form the gash in his face. I have a couple other things that I'm going to be using. For one thing, I have every sculpting tool known to man. I'm going to be creating the look of him having his eye off-center, and so I'm going to be using this glass eye to create the look that it's been pushed out of proportion. I also have some pieces of bone from when I go out to eat. I'm going to have some little shards sticking out, and that'll kind of show that the skull's been broken. I'm going to start off, and I'm just going to show you this little area right here is about the extent of where his actual face cast runs, where that we can actually sculpt to, and it would still fit his face. The area that I would like to sculpt in will be just around the lip area here. I'm going to come up through here near the nose, up by the nose into the pocket of the eye, up around here where we're breaking out a lot of stuff. And I'm going to be covering his eye completely, so this is going to be a pretty big appliance. We're going to come in, and then we're going to finish up right at the mouth here. So right in that area is where I plan on sculpting. So the first thing I can do, this mold has already been prepared by having crystal clear Krylon sprayed on the surface, and that just keeps the oils from the clay from soaking into this and degrading the plaster. So what I can do is I can start kind of mapping out with little balls of clay the areas that I have interest in, so that I can start building up and figuring out my shapes. And while I'm doing this, I'm trying to think of what would it look like if you took a big old chunk of sharp rock and you pushed it into somebody's face hard enough to break their skull and to kick up the flesh and tear the muscle. What would that look like? You know, what kind of shapes would that create? How can I give it the illusion, once it's painted, that it is actually further under the skin than what his actual skin surface is? Because as makeup artists, we're not able to actually take away from the face. We can only add to it. So part of this is creating a sculpture that once the middle is painted darker colors like your blacks, your deep reds, blacks represent holes, and then on the edges where it sticks up the most, where it's torn, I can do flesh tones and lighter colors such as pinks and yellows that look like they're catching the light more, and that'll make them look like they come up more than they actually do. So because I'm covering his eye completely for this makeup, I'm not too concerned about the placement of his eyelids. I'll know that they're still there. I can certainly mark it for myself as I go, but for the most part, you know, I just know that his eye would normally be here, and I'm going to be shifting it back over here, and we're going to play around with the placement of this to see how it would fit best. Maybe, you know, up like this. Maybe it needs to be further out to be a little bit more disgusting, like it really got pushed out of whack. You know, tear the eyelids, you know, just really mess up his face so that we get a really gnarly effect, because I want this to be a really brutal attack. Just finishing out, just getting to that line just so that I know how far this is going to end up stretching. If you don't spray the plaster with crystal clear Krylon, you could also take like petroleum jelly and saturate the surface with that. It makes it a little difficult at first to add the clay to it unless you go really sparing with it, but it helps kind of seal the surface. And depending on what you're going to be using as what you're going to fill the mold with, let's say that I wanted to make a silicone appliance out of this, which in this case I'm actually using gelatin, which isn't particularly picky about what clay you use because it'll set against most materials. Silicone is very picky, and because this clay has sulfur in it, silicone won't set against something that has sulfur in it. Or at least most silicones won't. So always know what your end result's going to be before you start on using materials for projects so that you know their compatibility. Plus, because this stuff is with the oils and the sulfur and everything, it's kind of nasty for the skin and stuff. Your hands are okay, but you wouldn't want to touch your face while you're sculpting because then you'll probably break out because it is a little harsh. So, I'm almost done just kind of blocking out the outside of this. And of course, it doesn't look like much yet. And you're just going through layer after layer of the process, so I don't expect this to really be like much. I also want to put maybe a couple of fake teeth right in here that have been pushed out of his gums, but we'll see about that in a bit. So one thing for sure is here is his cheekbone area right here. I want to split that open and make it like it's flayed out, like that thin veneer of bone just got snapped and it's got pushed up. So that's an area that I'm definitely going to have raised up. So I'm just going to start building some bulk right there. And everything tapers down to the edge where it's going to go into the skin. And then at that point, I'm going to very carefully sculpt it so that it blends into the stone. And so when I make my final mold, pour in my gelatin, pull out the gelatin appliance, that edge, once it's glued down and painted, you won't be able to tell where skin begins and the gelatin ends because it'll be a nice smooth transition between the two. At this point, just to kind of help me along with getting stuff where I need it to be, wooden tools are nice. They don't damage the stone because they're not sharp enough. The metal tools would definitely tear into the stone and make it pretty bad. So I'm going to have the nostril flare out a little bit right here, but I still want to create the look that it's just a continuation of that same nostril. Tear it up around the lips and stuff because it's going to go slightly into the mouth, and so I can kind of make it look like there is gum tissue underneath, and so this is all puffed up, and it would make sense. Actually, I can extend that out and make it look like it got pushed out and puffed up that much, just like I did the nose area. See, that's the thing about this, you know, you kind of evolve what you have in mind, because I don't have a drawing for this. I didn't mock up how this should look ahead of time. I just had an idea that, you know, okay, I'm going to bash a guy's face in. What would that look like? How can I achieve that? And of course, as I go through this, it's going to change, you know, layer by layer, trial by trial. Some stuff is not going to look right, and I'm going to have to, you know, scratch it and cut it off. Some stuff is going to look perfect, and I'm just going to keep on working it. But thus far, I'm doing pretty good. As you can see, this side of the mouth, where he has these nice contours in the side of his face where the muscle is, just bulking it up so that it's more of a continuation and it's not abrupt. It's actually coming up all together. Okay. So because it is a cleave this way and it's multiple bashes, I'm mostly going to have up here come to a point that kind of falls in line with how these are going, maybe a couple of multiple points, just so it looks like he got hit multiple times. So maybe do like a little jagged deal here. Maybe some stringy flesh coming down where just some muscle tissue is still just hanging on there. Cheekbone right here, I'm going to have that blown out, so I'm going to bring that up as well. One thing that's kind of cool is once I get it to the point where I've gotten the bulk of the clay on there, then I'm going to start going over it with little rakes. Just little, fine tooth, I don't know if you can see that very well, but fine tooth combs of metal that actually just pull little bits of clay away at a time. And there's different, rakes. Like this is a very sharp rake. There's very, very fine rakes where I just take like piano wire and just put it in a loop tool. A lot of these I make myself. This is actually made by a friend of mine. It's called Cutting Edge Sculpture. Rob Burns. Look him up online. Great, great tools. I should know. I taught him how to make them, and he made a company out of it. So good for him. I hope he continues his success and stuff. And you can start to see, that form of the cleave coming through. It's almost like tearing through the face. And you always want to kind of build things up just with little bits of clay, because if you put like a huge, block of something on there and say, hey, I'm going to make that work, I'm going to sculpt into it and stuff, it's just too much to deal with. It's not a small change, it's a huge change, and it's not even something that was really planned very well. So, like I said, continuing the contours of the face. Got to fill in through here so that it's a little more gradual transition between the skin and the appliance. One thing that's kind of difficult to figure out with this as I'm sculpting it is, here is pretty much the angle of the face, how you would see if you were looking straight down at it. And I don't have the rest of the face on this side to be able to see how this integrates into an entire face. So I have to kind of guess what angles I'll have to do, because realistically, let's see here. So that's pretty close to being the tip of his nose right there. I want to have this built such that the action's happening like this, and that this material is coming out off the face in an appropriate manner for the angle. And so maybe every once in a while, as I'm working it, I'll have to kind of take a look and see if things are actually being cleaved in the right direction and that they're peeling back how I would expect them to, and stuff sticks out from the side so that it has more dimension to it. Okay, so here's our eye. We can kind of push it down and over to the side, and I do want it to kind of look like it's looking off another direction, like it's really been pushed nasty. So that's pretty good, and of course, once we have it at that angle, it'll be like, oh my god, his eye is nearly falling out of his head. And the eye is just going to be in here temporary. Once I sculpt whatever shapes need to lead up to it, like the kind of stringy tendons or extra bits of the eye that aren't part of this glass eye here, then I'll remove it before I make the mold. Same with the bits of bone that I'll be adding to this. But I just want to create that nasty kind of stringy, just barely holding on eye. So just want to create some ligaments and tendons, like the things that would be controlling the movement of the eye that have been pulled out of whack. That's actually looking kind of cool. It's kind of stringy, kind of pulling out. And of course we'll make little severs in that so that looks like a sharp edge has been cutting into it. And I have to be careful, that I'm minding the sculptural plane as far as how far it goes down underneath, because I don't want any real holes in here. I want to have consistent texture, but still not build it up so much that it does look like a thick piece right on the surface of the skin. So let's start working into stuff, kind of get it bulking the right direction. After we rake the surface and clean things up a bit, we're going to be working in some detail, and there's a number of ways of doing that. There's tools that are really good as far as the ends of them having like little points, and let me see if I can grab one, give you an idea. Here's kind of a fun one. It's like a number of little wires on the end of this guy, and that's good for like creating little cross-hatch skin texture, because you want to exaggerate a lot of your texturing on your sculptures, because once you make a mold, the mold is not going to be perfect to how this is. Some of it, once I spray this to seal it, is going to be lost just from spraying it. Some of it's going to get lost just from the other mold half not picking up every bit of detail. It picks up a lot, but not every bit. And then on top of that, you have to put in release agent into the mold that fills up more of your detail. And then finally, the material that you put in there is not going to pick up every single detail in the mold. And so that's where you lost more detail. So really, you're compounding the amount of detail you're losing for each step of this process. And so what you want to make sure that you're doing is you're compensating for that ahead of time, so that once you get to your final prosthetic, you have enough of that detail that you intended to have there to represent skin detail. So just using a little wire tool, it's like a little loop, little angle tool, just digging out some of the clay around the eye, because I want that to be prominent. I want that to stick out on its own. One thing that sculpting is definitely akin to is drawing, especially when you think about how planes of light, and shadow converge. So really what I'm trying to do is play with the light, and you can really see it here, where I'm creating those shadows naturally so that when the light hits the actor, it will create some of the illusion for me of the depth. And if you only painted the lights and shadows on an appliance, if the light changes, then all of a sudden you have an unnatural shadow, because shadows fall wherever the light is not present, and you don't want it to look like it's going to be the same no matter which way you look at it and stuff. And especially if you have shadows contradicting each other, like you have a shadow here and you have a shadow there, well, then you don't have any actual light source for it that makes any sense directionally. Also, I want to be considering a lot of the anatomy of this. Kind of consider the muscles, the shapes underneath. Kind of give the impression of, you know, what the tissue that would support the skin would look like in these kind of situations where, you know, they're exposed and pushed up. Most makeups, I would try to keep them as thin and as small as possible. The reason for that is it will create more of an illusion of it being part of the face rather than something added to it. In this case, because it is going to be seen so quickly and it is such a mess, there's going to be a bunch of thick blood on this. He's going to be moving around quite a bit. I don't really have to worry so much about the thickness of it, because at least for that split second that you see it on screen, you know, here and there, it'll just kind of read as, oh, there's something terribly, terribly wrong with his face. I'm just using the wire tool to kind of even out these surfaces leading up to the damage. And, you know, kind of create some dips, maybe some wrinkles, some, you know, folds where the skin has, you know, buckled because of this unnatural folding of it and stuff. So I just kind of imagine, where does that happen? You know, does it, you know, thick part here, thick part here, thick part here, and then just have these little rolls of skin where it just, almost like old age, you know, just kind of folded on itself, lost some mass underneath. You can start to see some of the wrinkling effect going on there. I'm going to do a big old fold back here, so it really looks like the flesh has been pushed back and folded on itself. For a makeup like this, I don't want anything to be too flat. Like through here, where it's just a transition between the skin and where the skin is just going to be pushed up, there can be some that's a little flatter than others, but the rest of this needs to have a lot of dynamic shape to it to really sell that there's something seriously wrong with this guy's face, that some serious damage happened. And another thing is, don't leave your sculpture in one position. Tilt it, move it around, look around it, especially if it's something that encompasses like an entire head or entire arm, because once you sculpt one side, one direction, when you turn it, something's not going to be right because you're only concentrating in the one direction. So make sure you're moving it around, seeing how things change, how the light plays with it. It gives you a good indication of once this thing's painted and you put light on an actor, what's it going to do? What is it going to make it look like? What is it going to change? Now through here, because there's a lot looser flesh because of the cheek and the size of the mouth, I don't want to make the wrinkles as deep as I have around the top. If you think about it, when somebody gets older or heavier, they'll have these areas that are by the more stuck-on flesh, the stuff that's closer to the bone, that's more attached. That does more changing of shape as far as wrinkles than the areas where it's a little fuller, a little fatter. And so anything I do through here is going to be a little bit more subtle. It's just going to be just influences in the large shapes of it. I don't want them really, really deep, or it's just going to be like, okay, is this all going to be stiff? Some of these shapes I'm just doing inside here are just kind of squirrely, just breaking up the flats, creating some depth, some texture, creating a form that it's hard to distinguish what everything is except for what I want to identify as tendons and deep recesses, muscle tissue, things of that sort. I want to kind of differentiate all of these things. So, like, here's a kind of a muscle kind of surface right here. I'm going to add a little bit more to it so that it has kind of a flat to it, and then I'm going to make it look like it's been severed. So I'm going to give it the impression that it's coming out from underneath this skin, under here. And then to continue this, because I want it to be cut through and it's going to be on this side that it's going to continue, I'm going to have to create a little bit on this side just so it looks like it was cut in two. And then get that same angle underneath it as far as how it was cut. And not all shapes have to be true to how you would imagine. Some of these are just cheats. These are just, creating shapes that kind of give you the impression of something, but it doesn't have to be the absolute form of whatever it was. Because there's not enough room. There's some plaster right underneath. You can't create every single shape. And build up a little bit of gum right here. If I had a larger sculpture, I would start off with my heavier rakes, like this guy, and then work it down to get my bulk shape before I would get to doing the refined and then the detail. With this, because there's so little going on and most of the detail is actually within the messed up area, it doesn't matter that I've started chunking it out, because still I'm going to refine the shapes inside of here. But I'm really concerned at this point about just making sure that this all blends in around the edges the way I would expect it to. This is another difficulty of having so many sculpting tools, is finding what you need quickly. So I'm going to give it the impression that it's coming out from underneath this skin, under here. And then to continue this, because I want it to be cut through and it's going to be on this side that it's going to continue, I'm going to have to create a little bit on this side just so it looks like it was cut in two. just like before. I'm going to be cutting in a few little folds, wrinkles, you know, where the flesh is folding over on itself. And one thing you might be noticing here is I'm breaking up the straight edges a little bit. That helps with when I actually apply this. It won't be a flat line that will be easy to spot on the skin. It'll be broken up and, you know, just kind of blend in with the skin easier, just because it's not such a rigid looking contour. And so every once in a while, it's good to kind of take a break, go get something to drink, of course, and then step back from the sculpture and see if it looks far away the way it looks up close, so that it still makes sense visually. Because if I'm working at it at this distance and I take it way back and I look at it again, there's going to be something that I'll see that I either missed or it doesn't belong there, something that needs correcting. And especially when you're having larger sculptures that have, you know, more than just the one side, you can see if there is any symmetry or asymmetry between the sides, depending on if you were intentionally trying to make it different from one side to another, or if you're trying to line up the distance of the ear up and down to the other ear. You know, you have to be able to tell these things at a distance, because close up, you're kind of blinded by everything that's right in front of you. It's just too close to make those kind of judgments. I'm not only going in one direction with the rake, because that kind of flattens things out one way. Once I go over things and I kind of smooth them out with the rake, I go the opposite direction, like cross-hatching. That way, whatever was all directional one way is getting smoothed out the other way, and so I'm able to take care of two dimensions of the planes that I'm trying to create. So like right here, I'm just coming down and just kind of removing some of the surface clay, kind of helping, you know, create more of the form of these bulges and folds, helping to blend the clay into the stone here as far as where the edge stops. Once I create a little area like that where I'm starting to get the contours I want, I'll go the other direction, and that will smooth out all those directional lines I had before. And I'm going really, really light over the original raking so that I'm not creating new lines this way. I'm just cleaning up what was put there by the original raking. And what's nice is all these little fine raking marks help me to see what the flesh looks like, as far as, once it would have flesh texture on it. So it's a little smoother, a lot smoother than what's going on in the middle here, but at least I get an idea, okay, this is skin, this is what it's going to end up looking like, and I'm going the right direction with it. So these are little black open cell sponges. You can get them for doing makeup specifically. I went to like PetSmart, and they have this material as the filters for aquariums. And you can get it in different densities. This is like a really sharp one, a really open-celled one. This is good for, creating lines or cleaning excess clay off the surface, and this can actually help with creating skin texture, because you can kind of get these tiny little wrinkles going in the surface, and it helps get rid of that look of the raking on the surface. I don't know if that helps you get a sense of what that did. It's a little fleshier, a little nicer. Unfortunately, I am all out of the 99%, so I'm going to use some 70, and that should be fine. Nasty. Okay. And I just use, soft bristle brush, one that I don't plan on using for much of anything else. I just work over the surface. You can see that it's starting to eat at it a little bit, and that makes a nice, smooth, silky surface on the clay. And if you let the stuff evaporate as you're working it, that dissolved clay will redeposit elsewhere and help fill in little voids and everything in the sculpture. But then you can see it gets kind of chalky, so yeah, you want to rinse that off. This is especially helpful right here at where the clay meets the skin of the mold. It really gets rid of those tool marks and helps to blend it in to the edge so that it seems like it's part of that same contour instead of something completely separate. One little technique that's kind of fun if you're doing like texture on skin that's bumpy on top like zits, or if you're doing like dinosaur scales, you can actually take clay and some rubbing alcohol and you thin it down so that it's liquidy, and you put it in a little squeeze bottle, and you can actually squeeze out little dots onto the surface of your sculpture, and when they dry they become texture. And you can help work those in with sculpting tools to clean them up a little bit. Another technique that is really cool is to take process, which is a adhesive for appliances, and you mix in some acrylic color, like a just acrylic paint that's the same color as your sculpture, and then do the little thing with a squeeze bottle. And when it dries, it'll be the same color as the rest of your sculpture so that it blends in, and it will have the little bumps on there. And that's for like little smoother bumps, like age spots. And I'm not really worried about the liquid clay that got onto the edge here because I'm going to be cleaning that up right before I make the mold. Along with the eyeball, I wanted to have little chunks of bone. So I have these little pieces that were part of, I don't know, lamb or some ribs or something like that. I forget what this came from, but basically some really cool texture in there, and it definitely is bone, so it has that distinctive look. And I want to use as much of the jagged edges and the texture as I can, and just have little shards sticking out of the sculpture where I think the skull had cracked and is exposed, because I only need little shards. I don't need anything really big. Yeah, I want to avoid these really nicely cut edges of it because that's not natural to what I'm creating here. So, got some nice little pieces that I can chunk in there. Some fun bits. And let's start seeing where they live, where it makes sense for them to be. So there's some nice little shards of bone that are loose in there, and once it's painted up, that should be a nice incorporation to it because I'll leave the natural bone color and it'll just have a little wash of blood over it. When I do the actual mold of this, I'll pull those pieces out along with the eye so that I'm only casting the sculpture. Otherwise these will get trapped in the mold. I want to add these later when I have the actual appliance all done. So those are where they're going to stay, and I'm just going to sculpt around them, get that final look of the inside, and then we'll see about making a mold of this guy. So another cool technique, if you aren't doing like the rubbing alcohol, is to take some water on your finger and just kind of rub over the surface, because what it does is it keeps the clay from sticking to you, and so it's almost like a barrier so that you can smooth things out, and you can get things nearly glassy with that by just rubbing around with your finger. The only problem is that you don't have a huge amount of control when it comes to the folds, and so you might start damaging those as far as pressing too hard into them. But otherwise, yeah, use your fingers quite a bit. You know, they're very helpful for, you know, cleaning stuff up and making things a little smoother. Okay, so let's go into here, and this is where wire tools that have the little loops on them come into play quite a bit, because they're good at tearing away little bits of detail, and right now I want to work on getting these muscles looking more like muscle. Muscle, if you look at your anatomy books, has those little strips in them, you know, where the fibers of it separate. So I'm just going to kind of draw some little thin parallel lines into it, kind of go in the direction I think this muscle would be going. And for the other side, once I clean that up, that will have the same marks so that we know it's a continuation of the same one. Okay, and we're going to just go in, and on either side of these lines we're just going to pull up. Like go into the base of each one of those lines, dip in and pull out, and just drag over the top, and it creates a little bit of curvature to the line, and we'll do the same on the opposite side of the line. So if we went one way with it, we can turn it around so we have an easier time. And we just dip into the bottom, we just drag across the other way. And it makes this nice kind of curved lump, and that's what I'm looking for with this muscle. It's just these little curved lump lines that are just like almost separated, but they're still connected tissue. And this kind of stuff can go pretty quickly if you're pretty good at it and stuff, you know. And it doesn't have to look perfect yet. We're going to use the alcohol, and we're going to rub over there just like we did with the wrinkles out here. And that'll smooth that out and make it a little bit more like muscle. Okay, you can see that kind of texture developing. Now I'm going to go in with my alcohol again, and I'm just going to brush over those real quick, smooth them out. So there's my cleaved muscle, and what I also want to do is I want to texture the edges of the muscle where it actually got cut, because there's all those little ends of the fibers, and this is where one of my favorite tools comes into play. It is a ball stylus. I don't know how well that is easy to see, but there's a tiny little ball at each end of these. Like this is a tiny one, this is one that's a little bit bigger, oops, right there. And so I can just go in to the edge of this and just poke, create little pockets, little voids, little bits of texture like the fibers are just opened up from the end of this. And if I wanted to make it a little softer, you just take a little alcohol and just kind of tap it. I'm not going to run over it because then it would get rid of the nice little holes. But this is nice because it kind of softens the edges of these little holes and kind of makes it look more like it's just little stringy bits. Which is kind of nice. Okay. Now we're going to do something similar to these little tendons holding on to the eyeball. We want to kind of create those little thin kind of stretchy bits. Now with this one, after we clean it up as far as the shape, we can just use that ball stylus again and just create those little lines because they aren't as separated as the ones in the muscle here. So. Alright, and because I'm just going to be running those little lines along there, after I do that, then I'll smooth it with the alcohol. So I'm just going to create some little stretchy lines on here. Just all go in the same direction, just kind of selling the idea that it's just a stretched tendon or muscle that holds onto the eyeball and steers it around. Just from the direction it's coming from as far as out of the eye socket, you know, where it would normally hold it. So I have those nice little lines. Now I'm going to soften them up with some alcohol. I'm just going to run along the length of them. I don't want to destroy the lines, I just want to soften them. These are my daughter Michaela's baby teeth that I had saved over the years. Of course, yeah, the Tooth Fairy got these, yeah. So, found a couple of them that I like the shape of them. I think that would be appropriate for this. Now, these I'm actually going to leave into the sculpture for when I cast this because I'm not going to have her actual teeth on his face. I just want to include them in the sculpture so that when the appliance is done, I can paint that portion of the appliance to look like the teeth so that the teeth don't get messed up later on and they're still intact. But for this, I just want to create little spaces for them to be. And then I'll just work around those and kind of give it similar texture to what the cut muscle looked like so that it looks like it's been cleaved through. It'll help create some depth underneath. Through here, the little cut edge of the flesh that is peeling away, don't want that to look like it's part of the tooth. I want that to be separate. So I will play around with my ball stylus on that and make sure that it is a different texture. And then just kind of dot over the top of that just to soften them up. the last little detail I want to add is some skin texture so that it has an easier time blending in with his skin. And there's a couple of different ways you can approach that. That sponge that I showed you before, you can certainly poke that and that'll give you a very, very fine detail. You can use the ball stylus like I was using to swirl around, but to really help preserve the surface of the skin and give it texture, I'm going to put some cellophane on it. I have this tool, and it has what looks like tiny little nails at the end of it. I'm just going to poke this into the surface, and this bag is keeping me from piercing the clay too much. Plus it softens the blow of these dots so that they're not so deep. And I can show you what that's starting to look like, if you can see that. Just tiny little dots, a little texture. And even if they may seem a little deep now, if you can see that when we do the mold and then we do the finish appliance, they'll be a lot more subtle because they're so covered up by so many layers of technique. This also has a pointed end. It's a little sharper, but I can get into the finer areas with it. Kind of poke those. So I just got to be careful because it is really sharp. I'm not overdoing it. This is good for when you're doing the bottoms of wrinkles that you can't really reach with the broader ones. Let's see if that starts showing up a little better. Yeah, you can see that. So that it's not tearing it up too bad in some of these deeper recesses, I'm just going to use my ball stylus to tap some of these in. And areas, especially like the nose, have some really deep skin texture. So that I get a little bit of texture on where the lip's supposed to be. I'll use this little separated kind of rake looking tool. And I'll just very carefully kind of strike over that, creating those little wrinkles like you'd have in your lips. And the last thing I'm going to do, after I just kind of tap down some of these harsher dots, soften them up a little bit because some of these are a little too deep. Just to kind of give some more skin texture, you know, there's little tiny lines in our skin, you know, just here and there that kind of, you know, just break up the surface a little bit. I'm going to use, you know, that similar kind of rake and just carefully kind of just follow along the wrinkle lines and just kind of do some cross hatching. And it just adds another dimension to the look of the skin. And it's kind of funny because if it's not there, visually you kind of miss it, you know, and so it's something good to think about incorporating into the look of your sculpture. Helps break it up, make us a little bit more natural, especially where these folds exit. It's good to have some little lines kind of flailing out. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Plus it helps to soften up those deep pores that I put into there. Think of like a really, really smooth hippopotamus. You know, like hippos, they have these really deep, crisscrossing, hatched wrinkles everywhere. And we just want to make kind of like a soft version of that. This is especially good along the edge where you want to have that texture continue all the way down to where it's going to be glued down to the skin, so that it's not like all of a sudden all the texture stops and then there's a little strip and then the texture starts up again on the actual skin. I'd say this guy is done. I'm going to take some nice photos of him, and then before I cast him, I'm going to take crystal clear Krylon and spray over the surface. That's going to seal the clay and prevent the oils in it from being soaked into the new mold as it sets. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a clay border all the way along here that exposes just about 1/8 of an inch of stone, about that far away. And that's going to be my cutting edge all the way along. So when these two molds fit together, that's where they're going to touch, and that's where they're going to create the thinnest edge so that I can glue it down onto the actor. And so you'll see clay all the way out from there, except for around the keys, and maybe even a little area for support. So like I said before in the last video, I have at least 3 points of intersect. I may even do one back here, just so that it has a flatter seat when it fits together. But that's the sculpture itself. I hope you learned a lot, and we'll move on to the next part in the next video. Thank you.